Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. It's been just over a year since my guest today, Pierre Krähenbühl, made his first official visit to the Gaza Strip as the then newly appointed chief of the UN agency tasked with aiding the world's 5 million Palestinian refugees. Now, at the time, he vowed to advocate strenuously to end the blockade of Gaza and to stand up for what he called the collective punishment suffered by the residents of Gaza. Now, this week, we had an internal UN inquiry that came out, finding that Israeli military actions claimed the lives of 44 Palestinian civilians who sought shelter in UN-run schools during last summer's conflict in Gaza. Thanks for being in our studios today. I'll give our viewers your full title. It's a long one, but you are the Commissioner General for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. It's a big title, but it's important because I want to begin by saying your agency is a very big one within the UN, but it was created specifically for Palestinian refugees, originally about 700,000 of them, right, fleeing after the displaced after the creation of the Israeli state, 1949. Did you ever think that almost 65 years later, as we sit here, your agency would still be in existence, but not just 700,000 Palestinian refugees, now we're talking 5 million?
Absolutely. I think most people would never have thought that the agency would be in existence and in operations for as long as that, living through, some very big chapters, of course, of the region's history. I think of course, the 1967 six-day conflict and then the ensuing occupation, of course, of both the West Bank and Gaza. We had the Lebanese civil war in which Palestinian refugee camps were caught up. We had the intifadas. Now we had several conflicts in Gaza and, of course, the protracted conflict in Syria with multiple consequences for Palestine refugees again. It's something that I think the world really has to be aware of and take the measure of.
The agency has a budget, I guess, of about $1 billion, a little over $1 billion a year, if I'm not wrong. And yet it's still facing deficits. And I assume that's because, like you were saying, the sheer magnitude of what you're facing, growing numbers of people who are registered as refugees, Palestinians.
Indeed, I think you have to take the measure of what it means to have 5 million people and to have a provider of services that UNRWA is for this population. It's the same population as Norway or Singapore. And we provide the education services and the health services, among others, but those are the key components for them. So we run 700 schools, for example, throughout the Near East for 500,000 school children, boys and girls. We run about 130 clinics for primary health care for these communities and have systematically reached very, very high levels and standards in that regard. Now, in addition, we have to deal with the emergencies like last year's conflict in Gaza, where we sheltered 300,000 displaced people in Gaza in 90 school buildings, and, of course, what's happening in Syria. That mix creates the enormous pressures, both in terms of achieving results for people, but also mobilizing the resources for that.
Now, your mission then is strictly really a relief/humanitarian one. It's not really political, but you imply that your ultimate goal, I guess, for any refugee agency is to make sure that see those camps shut down, to bring an end to the refugee status. Do you have any hope? I mean, essentially, that would put you out of a job, but do you have any hope at this point in time that that is actually a realistic objective?
Well, the first thing is it's absolutely true that we have a focus on humanitarian and development issues, and we are not mandated to be a political agency. However, of course, on a daily basis, what we see are the human consequences of the unresolved political issues, the occupation and the blockade, but also the overall conflict between Israel and Palestine. And so certainly we advocate for a just and lasting solution to be found to the plight of these 5 million refugees, because we see them now for decades, facing not only the trauma of loss and dispossession, but of the absence of hope and prospect. And, in this unstable Middle East, hope is very much needed.
And you just used the word decades. And one of the Palestinian, it was originally called a camp, Yarmouk in Syria, right on the edge of Damascus. It's essentially a part of the city now. You were telling me before the show, they really have their own administration, but you don't have access, your agency really, to the inside of Yarmouk refugee camp anymore. You can't get in. You have to work on the outside.
So a month ago I visited Yarmouk myself and was at one of the distribution points that we run to provide assistance to the civilians that were coming to receive both food aid and medical attention. And you could see people already very weakened by 2 years of siege, but also the result of the presence of armed groups inside and the suffering that
Could I just interrupt you? You said a month ago, so obviously before it was overrun by the Islamic State group.
Correct. And now, 2 weeks ago, I returned to Damascus to see and visit people who had fled Yarmouk as a result of the most recent incursions by armed groups, and to see the level of despair, of course, that they're confronted with. Now, there's only one piece of good news in the middle of all this, is that we have been able to expand our assistance to civilians fleeing Yarmouk who are now in neighboring areas, Yalda, Babila, and Betzahem. And there, really, our teams on the ground have done remarkable work. But
how many people do you have on the ground there?
Well, we have 4,000 people working inside Syria because they have been carrying out for decades education and health work. They're now focusing on many emergency activities. But the worry is really about those civilians remaining inside Yarmouk right now, and of course the level of security or insecurity.
How many are there left? We were saying 16,000 until recently.
Well, the full number, 18,000 before the latest events. Now several thousands clearly have left. There are still several thousands inside. Very difficult to come about the exact figure, but our concern remains to be able also to reestablish supplies for the civilians who remain inside.
I want to ask you about Gaza itself, because I mentioned in the beginning that you went there last year in April 2014, and you were very struck at the time by the Gaza fence. It made a very big impression on you. And it sounds like a situation, residents there often describe it as an open-air prison. It's become very permanent, it seems, a situation, in the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks seem to be at an impasse. Where do things stand in your evaluation right now?
Well, the first thing, indeed, that struck me when I visited last year, on the first visit that you referred to, was the sheer unsustainability in human terms of this situation. You know, you have inside Gaza, even before last year's conflict, over 800,000 people were on UNRWA's food distribution lists.
In Gaza?
In Gaza, out of a 1.8 million population. Now, that means you have people who are highly educated in Gaza. You know, they've gone through our schools and other schools. They are able, and most of them were employed or employing people in their businesses. And when the blockade was imposed, which again, under international law is an illegal blockade, it led to an incredible increase in the number of unemployed, of people who suddenly could no longer cope with the needs of their families and were dependent on food aid. You know, humanitarian agencies sometimes take pride in their statistics of how many people they reach.
Right.
That figure is not a figure of pride, it's a figure of shame for the international community.
You said 800,000. That is up from 20,000 in 2000.
That's strictly speaking up from 80,000 in 2000, but it's 10 times more people than was there before the blockade.
Exponential, and I guess some people would also argue that the actual difference in the conditions of living between those registered as refugees in Gaza and those just living as civilians is not that big.
No, in the meantime, of course, everybody is affected, and you have to take the measure of what it means to have been affected not only by the elements of the blockade, and I speak about the unemployment and the lack of ability for them to take care of their own families, but now, of course, you had the cumulative effect of the war, the destruction, 120,000 people still homeless after having lost their apartments and their houses, etc., that were destroyed in the fighting, plus, and this is really the time bomb element that one has to have in mind, 65% of the population in Gaza is under 25 years old.
Very young population.
These are educated youth, but with no prospect of employment. And I can tell you this is a security issue. It's a human dignity dimension, but it's also a security factor on the entire region.
And on the report, I just want to mention, it cited that 44 Palestinians lost their lives as a result of Israeli military actions. That, of course, is just a fraction of the more than 2,200 Palestinians who are said to have been killed in that conflict, of course, and 72 Israelis as well. We've seen a lot of these reports. Do you find that anything actually comes of them? Do they ever really succeed in changing the political climate?
Well, the first thing that they needed to document, and we were, of course, very much also interested in that part, what exactly happened last summer. In particular, Secretary General's report looked at what happened with some of our schools that were hit, as you indicated, by Israeli artillery fire. Then there were also schools, 3 of them, that were used by armed groups in Gaza to place weapons components in them temporarily and other elements of that nature. We also lost 11 colleagues. Of course, the report looked into all of that. And I think it's an important element of the effort towards accountability. But of course, this report in itself looked at last year's conflict. This does not mean, of course, that it will result in a change in the political paradigms, which is very much something that was called for after the end of the conflict. People said, we cannot go back to the status quo. And yet, to be very honest, we haven't seen a great change in the political dynamics around Gaza since then.
And Pierre Krähenbühl, I'm just going to leave our viewers with some words that you said last year during that visit to Gaza. You said, nothing prepares you for Gaza. No amount of UN humanitarian reports, no amount of newspaper articles, no amount of human rights investigations, none of these can adequately convey what the people here are going through. So I guess sort of a measure of just how challenging a task you face. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I'll remind our viewers, you're here in Paris. You'll be meeting with the French foreign minister, and you're going to be talking about these issues, Gaza, Syria, and presumably some other challenging parts of your job. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24. Stay tuned for more news ahead.